Alright guys, welcome to the video for the New South. Remember you have a quiz on Monday for this, so this is just kind of a review for you to help you kind of get ready for that, okay? So here we go. We're going to start off here. Remember that the time period we're in, we called it the New South, and we called it sort of the Redemption Era as well. So both of those things are kind of talking about the same time period. It's the time period right after Reconstruction in the South. And one of the things you have to know about this slide right here is you need to know this guy's name, Rufus Bullock. You want to know that he's going to be the last Republican governor in Georgia for a really long time. He gets elected because in the 1868 election, this is going to be the first election where black men are allowed to vote. Remember, no women could vote yet, not until about 1920. We need to know that Rufus Bullock is a Republican. We want to know that he ends up kind of sort of hurting his political chances of, winning a future election, because that was the election where a bunch of black legislators were elected and they got removed, and he spoke out against that. And then after that, the Congress in Georgia, the Georgia General Assembly, kind of goes against him. He sort of they do what's called censuring him, basically telling him to mind his own business, and he can't really get those men reinstated. And then he loses the next election, and the Democrats kind of take control of Georgia, right? And those Democrats kind of kick off what is called the Redemption Era in Georgia. And the Redemption Era is going to be all about trying to basically get the South the way they want it, make the South better than it was after the Civil War, basically. And so you want to know that their goals for the Redemption Era is to increase the South economically, rebuild everything that was destroyed during the Civil War, and then basically get the South economy moving again. So we want to diversify the crops. Don't just grow don't just grow cotton, grow food, grow corn, grow wheat, so you don't have to buy it from other states. Keep your money here in the South. They wanted to try to get Northerners to invest in building factories and mills and everything they could to sort of produce more things in the South, so that will bring money, create jobs, and get the economy moving as well. It's important that we know that the Redeemers did not want social change. They were segregationists. They were white supremacists. They did not want equality for minority groups during this time period. Okay, so that is going to be very important. All right. Examples of the Redeemers would be the people who made up the Bourbon Triumvirate. And remember, I told you do not have to know their names, Brown, Colquitt, and Gordon. But you do need to know what their goals were and how they worked to get those goals. So what you want to know is that the Bourbon Triumvirate was made up of three men who sort of alternated through power for about 20 years in the Georgia government. They would try to hold down the governor, because you can be governor for 4 years, 2 times in a row, so 8 years. So they would sort of try to make sure that one of them held that position. And then they would get elected to either state or the federal legislature, the House and the Senate, and they would try to basically get laws passed that would help make them money and get their sort of goals for Georgia passed. So these three guys kind of ran the state of Georgia for about 20 years. What we want to know about them is that, like the Redeemers, they wanted to increase sort of production or the factories in the South. They also wanted to diversify the crops. But they also did something kind of interesting. They wanted to lower the taxes in the state of Georgia so that they could lure businesses who would have to pay like higher taxes if they were doing their business out in, say, New York or Pennsylvania, so that they would move here and produce things here in Georgia. In order to do that, they had to cut the services that they offered. So remember that with the tax money that we, the citizens, pay, they use it for bridges and schools and things like that. And they were going to offer less of those kinds of things, and then they were going to cut the taxes so businesses would come here. All right, it's important to know that the Bourbon Triumvirate were the ones who basically advocated for the convict lease system. You want to know that they were the ones who said, we're going to let private businesses lease or rent people from the prisons to come and work for them for free, and they're going to pay the government and also bribe these three men in order to get to do that. It's because it basically lowered the labor costs. They got free labor in their factories after they paid the fee. Now, That today is illegal. You can't really do that. You can have people work on the side of the road, and you can have them do things like pick up trash and stuff like that. But that's doing public work. You can't have them work for private companies, really. Now, you do want to know that the way the Bourbon Triumvirate, their sort of influence wanes is as these men get older, they retire, some of them died, that kind of thing, okay? All right, next guy we got to talk about is Henry Grady. We talked about him quite a bit, and we said that what we really need to know is that he's the one who was the advocate or the spokesman for the New South. He's the one who came up with the term the New South. And remember that Henry Grady really loved the city of Atlanta, and he wanted to see it grow. And he used his sort of position as a journalist for the Atlanta Constitution to try to sort of advocate or, try to publicize the city of Atlanta and get people to want to come here. And one of the ideas he had was that he decided, I'm hearing about this World's Fair, this thing where people are going to big cities like New York and Chicago to see new inventions. Maybe I can do something like that in Georgia. And he decides that we're going to do that, but it's going to be based on agriculture. So he starts the International Cotton Exposition, which was like the World's Fair, where you would go to see the newest, radio or car or whatever. But instead, you're going to come and see the newest tractors or fertilizers or farming tools or whatever. And it brought a lot of money into the state because people were, thousands of people were coming to the state and staying in hotels and staying in restaurants and all that kind of thing. But it also brought in investment in the city because people started to realize that Atlanta's a pretty good place to do business. It doesn't get so cold in here, in the winter that you can't, the roads are not impassable. It's hot in the summer, but it's, not that bad. You can do business here year round. Plus, it's in a good location to, do business with the rest of the South, which is all based on agriculture. And so you brought in a lot of companies because of the publicity that they got for the Atlanta Cotton Expo, which brings in money and jobs into the state of Georgia. We want to know that he sort of leveraged all of that, the sort of publicity and the money, to sort of get the funding to also help start the Georgia Tech, okay, the Georgia Institute of Technology. All right, then we said that that Grady, we said that he was he was basically seeing Atlanta through rose-tinted glasses, which means he saw the good stuff in Atlanta, but when he was writing his articles, he wouldn't necessarily talk or advertise the bad stuff. So if you were in New York and you were reading an article by Henry Grady, you would say, oh, wow, Atlanta, it's this great city. There's all these new businesses and new technologies being invented there. That's great. But he didn't necessarily tell the truth when it came to the sort of racial problems that the South was facing still at this time. And so a lot of businesses or business owners would go to the South and then get here and be like, yeah, it's nice here, but there's a lot of problems here too. And it made them sort of feel like, he should have been telling the truth about all parts of the South. Also, other places in Georgia kind of got mad at him because he really only publicized the city of Atlanta, and they felt like he should have done more to publicize other major cities like Savannah and Augusta and Columbus and Macon and places like that, okay? All right, let's go to the next one. This is just a picture of the Atlanta Cotton Expo where they actually did the event at, right? This is just talking about the actual expo. Just know that that's where people went to sort of, see all of the new stuff that was coming out, okay? All right. Booker T. Washington, super important guy. Got to know him. Got to know Atlanta Compromise speech. And you need to know that he delivered that speech at the International Cotton Expo. You don't have to necessarily know the year, 1895. That won't be something that I need you to memorize. But I need you to know that he did give that speech at the Cotton Expo. Why would he give a speech about racial injustice at the International Cotton Expo? Well, where else in Atlanta or in Georgia or anywhere else were you going to have that many people around to hear what you were going to say? It was just about sort of access to people, okay? He wanted people to hear his speech. And you need to know sort of his background. You want to know that Booker T. Washington was born a slave, ends up, once the Civil War's over, he's free, he goes to college, gets an education, and he becomes a very successful college professor. He also helped start the Tuskegee Institute, and he's really tries to do a lot. And we want to know that in his Atlanta Compromise speech, he's like, well, I'm successful, but how can I help other Black people get successful too? And so he decides that the way to get sort of racial equality is through not sort of resisting inequality, not boycotts and protests and marches and things like that, those sort of in-your-face, resistance. He said instead what black people should do is they should make sure that their children get an education, and then they get into fields like being lawyers and doctors and professors and engineers and politicians and dentists and, things like that, high-paying, sort of well-regarded jobs in society, so that if you've got a lot more black people in those positions, then the white people would come around to seeing them as their equal or people that they could respect, and then over time, that was going to lead to racial equality. The problem with his plan is that he knew this, was that it was going to take a really long time. So if you were an adult and he's like, hey, focus on your kids, then that means that you in your lifetime might not see equality. And so for a lot of those people, that was a hard pill to swallow, because it might not even be their kids or their grandkids that see equality. It could be their great-grandkids, but eventually they would get there. This is it's a plan that makes sense, but it could take a while, right? Okay. Tom Watson, we talked about him quite a bit. You need to know who Tom Watson was. So Tom Watson was at first a politician, and when he gets into politics, he gets elected to the Georgia General Assembly in 1882, it says, and while he's there, he decides that he wants to try to get legislation passed that would help sharecroppers and tenant farmers. And it's important to note that early on in his career, he was not a white supremacist. He says he wanted to help white, sharecroppers and tenant farmers and black sharecroppers and tenant farmers. He wanted to help everyone. And basically, while he was in the Georgia General Assembly for the first couple of, the first year while he was there, he decided that the other members of the assembly were not really on the same page as him. Besides helping those groups, he also wanted to, get more money for education and start more public schools. But the other people were not really interested in doing that. And so he ends up resigning from the Georgia General Assembly, and he doesn't even serve out the full term. After he does that, he gets involved with a new political party that's starting to grow in the South called the Populist Party, which would stand for the People's Party. And basically, this party, like Tom Watson, was focused on, helping the conditions of farmers, sharecroppers, tenant farmers, those kinds of people. And he gets involved with them, and, he starts going around the South, seeing the conditions people are living in, starts advocating for them. And then he ends up running for Congress again later. Now, while he was in Congress that first time, he did get a pretty important bill passed. It was called the Rural Free Delivery Act. And basically what this was a law that said that the mailman basically would come out to your house and deliver your mail. So that is important, because you got to think right around the turn of the century, when Tom Watson was in Congress, most people didn't have cars, and if you lived far outside of town, you didn't go get your mail, which made it hard for you to, get the news. It made it hard for you to get bills that were coming, or if you had packages being delivered. So it made it very hard for you to sort of carry out your business, especially, because it was just hard to get the stuff to do it. And so having the mailman come out to your house was a huge deal, and he helped that get passed. It helped poor people, it helped people who lived far outside of town, that kind of stuff. Now, he does run for re-election in 1892, and he ends up losing. So that is important. So if you look right here, the Populist Party, they got, they started to lose their sort of, influence in Georgia around the 1890s, and Tom Watson kind of, after he loses his re-election to Congress, kind of goes away for a little while. And when he goes away, he comes back in 1904 into sort of the public eye, and it's because he started writing this newspaper called the Jeffersonian. However, this paper basically shows that Tom Watson's views on race and equality have completely changed, because in this paper, he is basically espousing or saying a lot of the same ideas as people like the Ku Klux Klan. He was talking about how he doesn't like black people, how he's a white supremacist. He also did not like Jewish people. He did not like Catholics. And I think a lot of that has to go with the fact that there was a lot of immigrants starting to come into the United States right around the turn of the century, because Europe was going through economic problems. World War I starts in 1914, and so there was sort of, ethnic problems over there with different ethnic groups, people fighting. So a lot of people were coming to the United States for opportunities and jobs and all of these reasons, and there was lots of new types of people around, and I guess his views on race started to sort of morph over time. They said that this paper was so bad, it was such a sort of I guess so sort of white supremacist focused that in a lot of northern states, the mail system wouldn't even deliver the paper. They said it was so bad. So that's going to be a big deal. Now, if you look right here, it says Tom Watson runs for Congress again in 1918, but he loses to a guy named Carl Vinson. That guy's going to be very important later. He was a huge deal for Georgia because he, during World War II, and World War I is going to get a lot of military bases and like Navy bases, like naval money for naval bases and stuff in Georgia. So he's gonna be a big deal, but not so much for this quiz. We do want to know that he does get elected to Congress, to the federal Congress in 1920, but he dies 2 years into his 6-year term, and he gets replaced by a woman named Rebecca Latimer Felton. You want to know her just because she was technically the first female senator in the United States Congress, but she was only there for one day because remember the governor had to pick someone, and so he picked her to step in for a little while, and then they got a guy to replace her. Okay, all right. Jim Crow South. We talked about this. You need to know what the Jim Crow laws were. These are legalized segregation laws. These are discrimination laws. And remember that the name Jim Crow comes from this guy right here. This was a character in what were called blackface shows, or sometimes they were called minstrel shows. You need to know that term. Basically, those were their shows where white people would dress up like black people and they would act like fools. They would, act like they were dumb, and it was like these discriminatory shows where white people were making fun of black people. And Jim Crow was like the most famous character in those shows in the South, and that's how the laws got their name. Now, the Jim Crow was basically a continuation of the Black Codes. We want to know that these are the laws that said things like white people and black people can't get married. These are the laws where the South was trying to prevent black people from voting. And technically, these Jim Crow laws should have gone against the 14th and 15th Amendment. That's important to know. Because remember, the 14th Amendment says that you have the same rights as every other citizen as long as you were born in the United States. And then the South was still passing these laws aimed specifically at black people, but they shouldn't have been able to do that because it violates the 14th Amendment. And then when they start passing laws to sort of stop black men from voting, that would have gone against the 15th Amendment. So that's going to be very, very important. You just want to know that underneath Jim Crow, separate everything. Separate schools, separate restaurants, separate churches, separate everything. You want to know that they limited voting rights, and also you would want to know that in the South during this time, there was a huge problem with lynchings, which is basically mob violence. You would have a group of white men. The Ku Klux Klan was starting to form again, so you could say it was like the Ku Klux Klan. But basically, they would people were getting hanged and killed. Georgia came in second as far as having the most lynchings in the South for that sort of 50-year period between the 1880s and 1930. So that's going to be a big deal as well. There were sort of efforts to try and stop the lynchings, but a lot of times the juries wouldn't convict the people that were accused of committing these crimes. Plessy versus Ferguson. Remember, if you see Plessy versus Ferguson, or just the word Plessy, I don't care if you, that's all, Plessy, separate but equal, okay? Separate but equal. Now, what that means is that that segregation is legal as long as if you have something available for white people, you have the same thing available for black people, okay? So if you have a white school, you have to have a black school. And theoretically, because of this law that happens with Plessy, they were supposed to be equal, but we said that they never were. The stuff for the white people was always just a little bit or a lot better than what they were offering to the black people. So they might spend, let's say, $1 million on the white school and only spend a little bit of that on the black school. And so that's why this is discriminatory, besides just the fact that you're keeping people separated just because of the color of their skin. Now, you do need to know the story of Plessy. You want to know that he was the guy who was 1/8 African American. He goes to try and get on the white train car, and they tell him no, even though if you look at this picture, he kind of looks like a white guy. And so what ends up happening is he is supported by some civil rights groups, and they have a lawsuit that goes all the way to the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court rules that Plessy was in the wrong because he was trying to get on an all-white train car, even though he is not technically all 100% white. And so they say that, he should have gotten on the black train car because there was one available to him, and so he lost his case. And that sort of sets up what is called the separate but equal doctrine. Okay, very important. Voting rights taken away. We've talked about this a lot. Remember that it's the 14th Amendment says that you're a citizen, and if you're a citizen, you have rights. That should have been enough to make sure that black men were allowed to vote, but it wasn't. And so the radical Republicans during Reconstruction made them pass the 15th Amendment, but the South is still going to try to limit voting rights, and they do that through a couple of things. The poll taxes, you have to pay a fee in order to vote. Literacy tests, you have to prove you can read in order to vote, and also the grandfather clause. Now, the reason why they had the grandfather clause is because some poor white people couldn't read. Some poor white people couldn't pay the poll taxes, and so they were being prevented from being allowed to vote as well. Sometimes they wouldn't be, they would just kind of overlook them. But the grandfather clause officially put a law in place where white people who couldn't meet the poll tax or the requirements for the literacy tests were allowed to vote anyway because their grandfather had either, or their father had either, or grandfather had fought in the Civil War, or they were eligible to vote before the Civil War. And so that was basically a way of sort of overstepping the poll tax and literacy tests for white people. The other thing you need to know is the white primary. Now, we said that a primary election is like, in the last presidential election, on the Republican side, remember, we had like Donald Trump, and we had Marco Rubio, and we had Ted Cruz, and we had all of these Republicans. And the primary election is where they sort of whittle that down. So all of the states will have their own election, and if most of the states say they want the Republican candidate to be Donald Trump, then Donald Trump becomes the nominee. And then the Democrats did the same thing. So all of the states had votes for the Democrat side, and they got down to Hillary Clinton. And then in the general election, we had Clinton and we had Trump. So the primary is where you're picking the candidates who are going to be like representing that political party. Now, in the South, what they tried to do was stop black people from voting in primary elections. And that's a problem because the primary election is where you pick the candidates who are going to run in the general election, and you hope that those people have similar points of views as you, or are going to be wanting to look out for you. And so by not letting black people vote in those elections, when it came down to the general election, what would happen is they would have two candidates on the ballot who neither one of them was a good fit for those people to vote for, and they just wouldn't vote. And these actions that were limiting voting rights for black people leads to this feeling of disenfranchisement, and that was a big deal. So I'm kind of highlighting that. You need to know that word. It's this feeling like you don't belong, or a feeling like your voice is not being heard, or your opinions are not being valued, disenfranchisement. And what it ended up doing is, even though some of the black people could fit, or they could meet the requirements for poll taxes or literacy tests or whatever, they felt like it wasn't worth their time to even go vote, okay? So that's going to be important. All right, next thing, 1906 Atlanta riot. Remember, this was started by a couple of things. So the economy was on kind of a downswing. People were having a hard time finding a job still in the South. And what happens is there is this argument, well, now that there's all of these, freed, people, there's no longer slavery, now they're competition for jobs. And so there started to be this sort of conflict between white people and black people over jobs. Then there was also, there's right around 1906, you started to see a lot of very successful black people. And so there was this jealousy among poor white people that felt like, oh, those people are taking their opportunity. And then Georgia had just had a governor's election where the two candidates had both been white supremacists and were saying some really terrible things during the election. And what ends up happening is it sort of leads to this, conflict between the two sides. And all of this result comes to a head when in 1906, a bunch of Atlanta newspapers started writing articles about how there were black men attacking white women. And this just there was all of this sort of like, the tension, and then this lit the match for there to be riots. And so there starts to be white people who are attacking black people in the streets of Atlanta, and then the black people, start fighting back. And then it resulted with 25 African Americans being killed in the 1906 Atlanta riot. And this lasted for 2 full days, and nobody could really get it to stop. The governor was sending in the police, it was a mess. And basically what happens is newspaper articles all around the country start talking about how we thought Atlanta was just this progressive city. There's all of this technology and all these businesses are moving there. it's like the most advanced city in the South, and now this is happening, and they didn't like that, and businesses were worried that they were going to be hurt economically by these riots, and also it's no fun when you look outside your business's windows and people are dying on the street. And so what happens is a bunch of business owners, both black and white, they form a committee, and both sides try to cool their sides down. One of the more famous people on the sort of black side was the guy who we said, Alonzo Herndon. He was the one who started off as a sharecropper and a slave before that, and then works his way up to working at a barbershop and then owning 3 barbershops and then starting the life insurance company. He was one of the people on the black side who was trying to calm down the black people from the riots. That's important. Make sure you equate him with that, okay? And basically what we need to know is this as well, this part saying that the Atlanta riots kind of show that Booker T. Washington's plans were not necessarily going to work fully. Yes, it's important to get an education and to get into positions of power and good jobs, but something needed to be a little bit more forceful. There needed to be quicker change if we were going to avoid future riots. And all right, we got to talk about Booker T. Washington versus Webb Du Bois. Both of these men, very important, and both of these men actually agreed on a lot of things. They both agreed that, education was important, getting good jobs and being in positions of power was important. But where Booker T. Washington said, don't really resist, this oppression, kind of let it die out as people see you in these positions of power and start to respect you, Du Bois comes up with his idea that he calls the talented 10th, and that is important. So remember that where Washington was born in the South and was used to Jim Crow, and he had seen all of the oppression. Du Bois did not. And so he was a little bit more willing to be outspoken against it. He was a little bit more willing to put himself out there without as much fear, maybe, as Washington. And so what he says is that those people who become the lawyers, the doctors, the teachers, the dentists, the professors, the whatever, engineers, those people are what we're going to call the top 10% of black society. These are the talented 10th. And those people should go out of their way to protest, to have marches, to write books, to give speeches, to try to change the hearts and minds of people so that equality can come faster. And his sort of reasoning is that these are the people who have the most credibility. Are you going to listen to somebody who's a teacher or a doctor more than you're going to listen to someone who is working in agriculture, for instance, as like a sharecropper at the time? And so he was saying that those people should use their positions to sort of advocate for the other 90%. Okay, and that's going to be important. So both of these men had similar ideas, but Du Bois is saying, put yourself out there a little bit more than Washington was. You want to know that he also helps form the NAACP. This is the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. This is an organization that was set up to sort of offer legal assistance to black people in the South who were facing unfair trials. So like if a black person was accused of, let's say, a murder, and the trial, there wasn't a lot of evidence, but because of the all-white jury, they were scared that maybe this person would be found guilty anyway. Du Bois was a Harvard-educated lawyer, and he sort of, when he forms the NAACP, gets a coalition of other lawyers to help him, and so they would send very well-trained lawyers to the South to try to help whenever they could. They also are still around today, and they do something similar. They offer lawyers and legal help to minorities and other people as well. And they also offer a lot of scholarships and help support like historically black colleges. So that's going to be important as well. All right, Alonzo Herndon, we just talked about him. He's the guy who was sort of a rags to riches story. He started the barbershops and then got into real estate where he made a lot of money. And then he started the life insurance company. So I'm going to kind of skip over this just to make sure you know that the life insurance company was where he was able to not only offer life insurance to black people who were sort of denied life insurance a lot in the South at the time, but also he was able to create, good high-paying jobs for college-educated black people, because a lot of those, people would graduate from schools and then not find, jobs in the white-owned companies. So that was important as well. All right. Leo Frank, we're not going to watch the video on here, obviously, but you do want to know that Leo Frank is the guy who was the the Jewish man who ran a pencil factory here in Georgia. And basically he was falsely accused of committing a murder of a young girl named Mary Fagan. And basically what you want to know about Leo Frank is that despite the evidence that he did not commit the crime, there was a lot of anti-Semitism in the South at the time, which is basically the hatred, prejudice, discrimination against Jewish people. And that wasn't the only thing that Leo Frank had kind of going against him at the time. He was also kind of a carpetbagger. Remember we talked about that term. He was somebody from the North who came to the South and was making a lot of money, but they saw him as somebody who was taking advantage or exploiting the people of the South, because he was running this factory where they were making pennies an hour and he's making a good wage as the manager of the factory. And so basically what we think happened is that the janitor at the pencil factory, Jim Conley, killed this girl. And then when someone saw him with the blood on his shirt, because he had moved the body down to the basement of the pencil factory, they think that he was able to lie and get Leo Frank, punished for this crime instead of him. And basically what happens is Leo Frank goes on trial, is found guilty, and given the death penalty. But before he's actually put to death, the governor of Georgia steps in and stops the hanging, and he sort of lowers his sentence or commutes his sentence is another term for that you might see on the quiz. And you want to know that basically he's given life in prison. But when other people in Georgia find out that his sentence has been lowered, they break into the prison where he is at, and they end up forming this mob and hanging him. They lynched him. And this is sort of an example of, sort of anti-Semitism against Jewish people. And you want to know that the people who did that called themselves at the time the Knights of Mary Fagan. And then later, a lot of those same men are the ones who sort of reformed the Ku Klux Klan in Georgia a couple of years later. So he was basically lynched by the KKK. All right, that's everything. If you have any questions, just let me know. Good luck.